Hello, happy Tuesday. Welcome back to another episode of The Practice. This show is an unrehearsed look into my workflow. I'm Stuart. I'm a 3D artist, illustrator, animator, and your pal, and I'm excited to have you back again this week. This week's subject is a little bit childish. We're going to be channeling our grade school potty mouth sense of humor, and we're going to be modeling and posing and animating this farting man character. As you can see, we're starting here by just using a simple cube, or starting with a simple cube and making some loop cuts and throwing it in a subdivision surface and using that to smooth out the edges of this rather simple character design. He's almost like the icon for the men's room. He's very, very simple. And then we're going to be using this tool that I've only found out about just recently. It is called the character tool, and it allows you, or the character object, it allows you to really simply and easily rig and start posing and animating many, many different types of characters. And you'll notice when you set it up, it's not just bipedal characters. There's quadrupeds, there's fish, there's all types of stuff in there. It's really interesting. A lot of potential, and I think something I'm going to be definitely addressing again in later episodes of the show. But as you can see now, what we've done is we've set it up for just a quadruped, and we've added a spine, and we've added arms and legs, and you can choose how in depth you want to make your rig. You can continue adding levels of details. You can add fingers and thumbs and things like that. You can add facial features. None of that I think is applicable for this very simple character. We're just going to be using the arms and legs and spine basically. And you can see that adds rigs and adds little controls for the manipulation of the character, and it's really sort of in depth. And I'm not gonna give a full usage tutorial, but I'm gonna say that you can set up a rigged character really in just a matter of minutes. It's pretty awesome. Now it's not the most perfect rig. I'm sure like all the pro riggers and animators out there might have some qualms with the simplicity of it all, and of course you have to go back and adjust things here and there, but it's really, really simple and flexible. And one of the things I love most about it is a lot of times when I've rigged a character, he's already the character is already too far gone to start altering the model itself again. What this allows you to do in the sort of 4 tabs of usage, you've got build, bind, adjust, and animate. What is it? No, build, adjust, bind, and animate, right? And you can always click back and turn off the pose and adjust your geometry, which I did several times. So now that I've got that mostly set up, I'm going through the controls and the handles, and I'm setting up a rather simple pose here. It's really just going to be this guy elevated off the ground due to the power of his flatulence. So he's flying through the air, and his feet are going to be sort of dangling behind him, and his arms are going to be asymmetrically posed. And we've got this, fairly dynamic pose, which I think is made all the more interesting by the sort of oversized feet. And so I'm digging that. It was a really quick process. A lot of times in the past, I would have gone over to Mixamo, or I would have just, sort of modeled the position by hand. I would have just grabbed the geometry itself and moved the character into this position, but definitely plan on utilizing this tool more often and getting a little bit more in depth. I want to play with the quadruped features and figure out this character modeling tool a little bit further. But in any case, so we spent about the first half of the episode getting this character posed and in a pretty good position, which is how we have him here. Now we're going to start adding the wind. So we're using a simple cone, strategically placed, which is going to be the exhaust here. And you can see I'm going through and adjusting his hindquarters a little bit. We wind up really expanding this object and really getting in there and using the sculpt tools to adjust this further in a little bit here. But we're going to get the general pose where we want it. We're going to add sort of a cloud at the end of this wind, which is just a simple series of spheres, kind of like a cartoon fart. Got a little cloud at the end of it. And so, this is a rather silly little model with some very childish humor. But it was a fun exercise. It was a break from the type of stuff I've been doing a lot lately. I also, use some lighting techniques that are not techniques that I use frequently. At least they're widely used techniques, and they render a really nice result. So there was a lot of experimentation here. So we're going to get into a bit of texturing. Again, I'm going to stick with really simple, bold colors. We've got sort of this light green and just a bright orange character. I'm using area lights, which are typically pretty expensive in terms of their rendering weight. So you can see some of that getting in there. I'm using some luminance in the material channels themselves to add a bit of additional visibility and to eliminate some of the hard shadowing that's happening. And I did, for a while there, I was using subsurface scattering on this cloud. It looked really great, and it added sort of like a waxy depth to that portion of the model. But I found it was taking forever to render, and we wanted to do this turntable animation, so I had to go with a simpler setup there, something that didn't take as long to render. And now back to the character. I was a little bit unsatisfied with how his rear end was looking, so I wanted to really make sure he had some sweet butt cheeks with which to put out this wonderful bit of gas. So I expanded the character, and so now he's just regular old geometry and is not really easily changeable from a pose perspective. But what that allowed me to do is go in and grab the geometry itself and use the sculpt tools to smooth out some of those rough edges and to add some cheeks. I wanted some nice round smooth cheeks on this guy because we've got quite a view onto the rear end of this character, and we want to make sure it's nice and smooth and looks great. So you can see here we're getting pretty close, much better than the first iteration for sure, but it's getting a little bit low poly where we sort of expanded some of the areas, and you could see some of that, some of the hard edges in the model itself. So I'm just using the loop tool, or the loop cut tool, and I am cutting additional subdivisions into this portion of the character, which is going to allow me to smooth it out really nicely. And what I like is if you hold shift, when you've got any of these sculpting tools going on, if you hold down shift, you can use the smooth tool, which when you're adding subdivisions and trying to change a bit of a character like this, the smooth tool is really, really handy, really super useful. So making use of that. You can see here, even in just our test rendering, the fact that we're dealing with a fairly high polygon model and these two area lights, the rendering takes a minute. And then when you saw there, I did a test and I turned the subsurface scattering off. Well, I turned off that cloudy bit of the model. And once the subsurface scattering was no longer present, the rendering was much, much quicker. So wasn't quite satisfied with where the cheeks were at that point, so I took another pass at smoothing them. They're starting to look much better. I think around here is where I decide that I'm going to use a little bit of alpha to get a somewhat translucent effect and add a little bit of noise just to make the cloud look a little bit less uniform. You see there that our rendering times are much, much quicker than with subsurface scattering. A note on that, if you have a single object, subsurface scattering maybe isn't too bad, but it does calculate the way light travels through objects. And with this cloud, there's a ton of overlapping high polygon shapes, and because of all that overlapping, the subsurface scattering is super time intensive. So in any case, getting closer. You can see the cheeks on this character look much, much better now than they did when we first posed him. I'm going to add just a very simple facial expression, really more of a shock and surprise. And then we're going to throw the camera inside of a circular spline. And what that allows us to do is animate and create this like turntable style 360 rotation of the model. And we don't actually wind up moving the model at all, even though it looks like that. We wind up moving the camera around the model. And then what? Oh no! We had a crash. This is the first time that cinema's ever totally shat out on me during an episode of The Practice. But luckily I'd been saving frequently and I hadn't lost any work. So after that crash, I reopened cinema. Everything was where I needed it, and that was good news. So So here we're getting closer. You can see we're kicking out more test frames. The buns are looking nice and smooth. We wind up adding a bit of noise to an alpha channel to get just a little bit more of a translucent look for that cloud. As I mentioned before, the subsurface scattering was super cost intensive, and especially with all those overlapping high polygon shapes. Just decided to move away from that just in the interest of manageable render times. And the result still looks pretty darn good. So there we have it. We're adding the camera now to a circular spline, which is a super simple way to get a 360 turntable rotation, animation to get those frames rendered out. Sometimes it's tricky to use a target light and to physically move the camera position. So adding it to a spline like that allows us to just do 2 simple keyframes and get exactly what we need in relatively short order. So I skipped the rendering process for the interest of time, and now we've got our frames here in Photoshop. We're just going to start compiling that final GIF. I rendered with an alpha channel just for a little bit of flexibility, but decided that the really dark blue background was the way to go. These colors seem to pop really nicely on a dark background. And our character, it seemed, wasn't quite centered, so I cropped just a bit to get a nice centered composition. And here we have the final piece. So thanks for tuning in. I'm really happy with where this turned out, the way this turned out. A little bit childish, a little bit irreverent, but still a ton of fun. If you want to keep up with me and the work that I'm doing, please hit me up on DLGNCE on Instagram and other social media channels. If you like what you saw, please give us a thumbs up. And if you want to see different subject matters for future episodes, don't hesitate to leave a comment below. This is Stuart saying goodbye. Thanks a lot. See you next week.